Good morning and welcome. My name is Toni Appelberg-Parks. I'm your local risk adjustment nerd. So basically, my background is as a coder, CDI specialist, revenue cycle specialist, a couple decades of patient-facing allied health, and then probably 10, 12 years somewhere in there in the revenue cycle field. So I've gained a passion for trying to understand, stay up to date, and pass on the information that I've learned about the ever-changing world of risk adjustment and clinical documentation improvement. So with that, this presentation will cover the critical RADV changes and increased scrutiny from CMS. RADV is a risk adjustment data validation audit. It's a type of audit that the government does around risk adjustment. And it's not a case of if but when at this point, because the landscape is shifting quickly and yearly audits are becoming the norm, not the exception. So our purpose today is to understand what it is that's changing, why it matters, and how our clinical documentation must adapt to these changes. The changes impact coding, chart prep, provider documentation habits, and even the payer-provider collaboration. So RADV audits are no longer a compliance afterthought. They do now impact financial stability and performance outcomes. So we need to shift from reactive to proactive strategies and build an audit-ready environment every single day. So let's review how documentation connects to the HCC's RAF scores, revenue, and compliance. This applies, it's applicable regardless of payer contracts, whether commercial, MA, capitated, or risk-based arrangements. The goal really is simple: document it clearly, code it correctly, and prepare for the audit before it arrives. CMS is expanding RADV audits. They're going from approximately 60 to around 550 audits per year. So this represents a massive increase in oversight, staffing, and enforcement. CMS is expanding their coding staff from 40 to 2,000, which means chart reviews will be more thorough and faster. Documentation windows have been reduced from 22 weeks to now only 12 weeks. Providers and coders need to work together because unsupported diagnosis codes will become liabilities during an audit. Revenue integrity depends on clear documentation, specific diagnoses, and accurate HCC capture. So, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it, right? Well, if you didn't document the specificity, it may or may not, and a lot of times will not, risk adjust because it's a lot of the generic or unspecified codes don't. And the accurate HCC capture also occurs if the coding is done accurately. To get to the proper coding, it's driven by the documentation. If documentation doesn't meet the MEET standards, monitor, evaluate, assess, treat, the codes may be removed by the auditors during the review. When this happens, risk scores drop and reimbursement is impacted. So we cannot assume any diagnosis will be accepted unless there is clear justification. So what this means for you is detailed notes, clear assessments, treatment plans, evidence of decision making. CMS has emphasized payment integrity and prevention of fraud, waste, and abuse, so whether it's intentional or unintentional. But the real takeaway is that perfect documentation is no longer optional. It is essential to operational success. Okay, so the audit trail, this is CMS's way of ensuring that every submitted HCC can be traced back to a defensible clinical entry. So it begins with the provider note, moves through coding validation and submission. If any step in the chain is weak, the diagnosis becomes vulnerable. Audit failures often stem from incomplete documentation or vague language or just outdated coding logic. Every diagnosis must include evidence that the condition is active and managed during the encounter. Conditions mentioned only in passing or copied forward, as in note cloning, without supporting information, are at very high risk. Providers must document the why behind their decisions, clinical validation. Coders must verify accuracy and specificity. So If it's not there, the coders are going to be reaching out to you. They're going to query you for more specificity. CDI teams, CDI specialists, or anyone doing chart prep should act as the bridge between clinical care and reimbursement protection. This is why we do chart prep, to help with that. So building an audit trail means anticipating CMS review and aligning the documentation to the risk-based payment logic. So it's not punitive, it's a chance to ensure that patient complexity is accurately represented. Okay, let's dig into audit failures a little. Most RADV audit failures do come from missing meat elements or problemless carryovers, cloning. Occasionally outdated HCC structures, that's not really a concern for us, as the EHR does get regularly updated. Or just contradictory documentation. One thing in the chart, in the assessment and plan, in the chart, in the note for that encounter does not match something else, another statement in the note. So maybe in the PE or something. So if the note does not clearly show active management of the condition, that code may be denied. So an example of this is a physician may list diabetes in the problem list, but did nothing to evaluate or assess it during the encounter, or if they did, they just didn't document that. So that's the same as not doing it in the eyes of CMS, right? In that case, CMS may rule that the condition was not actively managed and therefore should not impact risk scores, and they'll throw that code out. Another common failure is copying forward diagnosis statements year after year. So again, cloning, without updating the information. CMS is especially focused on these types of notes, these clone notes or outdated notes, or the utilization of just generic language, no details or specificity, and templated documentation if the templates are outdated. So in order to mitigate this, we need to think like auditors. If someone testing this diagnosis asks, was the condition treated or monitored at this visit? Can the chart defend that? Our responsibility is to support the clinical truth, yes, but also while protecting the code, protecting the associated reimbursement so that you can care for your patient. Tougher audits are coming, but strong documentation does protect the provider, both the provider and the patient story. So once again, MEET stands for Monitor, Evaluate, Assess or Address, and Treat. These are the pillars of risk-adjusted documentation. Every diagnosis should include at least one of these components. Examples: monitor blood pressure readings, symptoms. Evaluate, what's the response to the medication? Assess, what are your physical exam findings? Treat, prescription refills, medication adjustments, referral to a specialist, whatever your treatment plan is. The key is clarity. Vague phrases like stable, reviewed history do not provide enough detail. We need full sentences that show reasoning. Each documented condition should reflect ongoing management and provider involvement. A good habit is to link every diagnosis to a specific action or observation or decision. The MEET framework improves care quality, supports accurate HCC capture, and reduces audit risk just from that, sticking to that simple acronym. The transition from HCC V24 to V28 brings the changes in hierarchies, mappings, and coefficients, of course. So some of the conditions that previously mapped no longer do, unfortunately, actually a lot of them. There are others that require more specific codes to map appropriately. So I believe there are more HCC sets. So the payment year 2025 these are the payments received in 2026, but 2025 we're capturing all data, all codes based under the new V28 model. So since January 1st we've been doing that. So it's a good time to review if you hadn't, review your codes, check to see if one's codes that you thought previously mapped still do, although it's not totally necessary, because as long as you're documenting your patient care and your diagnoses, that'll work out in the coding. So, and we have to make sure our EHR templates are up to date. So if you run across anything that doesn't look like it has been updated, let somebody know. And then just be aware that, we're seeking out those documentation gaps or overly general diagnoses, not to pick on your documentation or to make things harder for you, but to help you to help you provide or understand how to provide the support for your diagnoses so that they stick, so that if there's an audit, those are not pulled back. Coders, of course, stay on top of the new codes and the mapping, the updated mapping. So, work with your coders. They can help you look these up or understand these if you need more information. But main thing is we want to stay ahead of the model, whichever model it is, to help prevent any kind of revenue loss associated with the changes, and also to reduce any vulnerability during any potential RADV audit. So, transitioning V24 to V28 just reinforces the need for an annual assessment of the diagnosis codes and the precise specificity in the documentation, because in the end, it's the documentation driving those codes anyway. So if you want to focus on one thing, that's the area to focus. Of course, both the providers and the coders play a critical role. It's up to the provider to generate the clinical evidence, and it's up to the coder to translate that evidence into codes that support risk adjustment. And unfortunately, or anyway, the current situation is that, providers also have to understand coding to an extent. But your coders are your subject matter experts, and they are there to help you with that process. So the best outcomes really happen when both groups understand each other's priorities and are able to collaborate, work together on achieving the same goals. So any CDI or chart prep functions, of course, will help facilitate this collaboration, and that's why we do this, and why the education focuses on, beating the drum of specific documentation, because once again, that documentation drives that code. So it's not just about compliance, but also patient representation, painting a clear picture. And the HCC capture is not only about just generic data, but it's accurately showing the true level of sickness of these patients and the care being provided. So when the documentation fails, risk scores drop, patients appear healthier than they are in the eyes of CMS. And that's reflected, in the RAF score. So working together, coders and providers, and having that mentality of teamwork helps prevent these missed opportunities and any resulting audit denials. RADV readiness requires structure. Best practices include scheduling internal audits regularly, and that's why we are auditing the gap closure. Reviewing high-risk HCCs each payment year. So we do look for those high-risk HCCs that are unclosed gaps. Of course, we are updated on these codes yearly as well. Identifying coding inconsistencies, double-checking signatures and credentials, okay, and creating a standardized submission process, which, for you guys, it's just a matter of coding it in the EMR and closing the note, signing the note, and then it's all automated through claims. And that's how the codes are submitted. So creating a standardized submission process and assigning processes for responding to audit requests. The goal is to build muscle memory, so when an official audit arrives, it feels like a routine process. Tracking every submission and ensuring that responses are timely keeps teams efficient and helps reduce the stress. So we should review our workflows and ask, if the audit came tomorrow, how prepared would we feel? From your standpoint, as long as you know that the documentation that you're providing supports the diagnosis that you're making and that you have documented that diagnosis out to the greatest level of specificity, then you're covered. You're golden. You can feel prepared because that's what we're looking for. Along with the clinical support in certain hotspots. An example would be like opioid dependency. That's a hotspot for audits, but as long as your documentation backs up, assesses the diagnosis, backs up that diagnosis, then you're good to go. So the question of how prepared would we feel, the question alone can guide meaningful improvement and promote accountability across teams. Successful RADV preparation requires collaboration, foresight, and consistent education. So the purpose of this is not to instill fear or stress, but really to help with preparation and resiliency. In RADV terms, resilience means documentation is strong, coding protocols are current, and every diagnosis is defendable. Organizations that build RADV into their daily routines, not just when requested, perform better and lose less revenue during audits. And so that is our goal, to be, to make sure we're one of those organizations. So we should normalize checking meet criteria, reviewing hierarchies, and validating coding steps. Technology or AI tools like those that we use can help identify gaps and optimize documentation before submission. When teams stay ahead of the audit curve, they maintain financial strength and protect their credibility. So the message is clear: continuous preparation, clear documentation, and just anticipate scrutiny. So in closing, I'd just like to mention that the RADV changes are not temporary. They are the new normal. They do represent the new normal. Every diagnosis must reflect active management. Every provider should understand the MEET standard. Every coder should check for mapping accuracy. Teams must build habits around internal audits and documentation reviews. Ultimately, our objective is to ensure that documentation tells the full clinical story and supports the complexity of our patients. Accurate documentation protects revenue and validates the care being delivered. It is our responsibility to represent patient needs clearly and to prepare for any scrutiny before it arrives. Thank you for your time and attention today, and please reach out if you have additional questions about this topic or any other. Thank you.